Hey, what's going on, good people? It's Gardner Douglas, your Oyster Ninja. I'm here today with Mr. Jesse and Miss Jennifer from Arundel Rivers Federation. Can I get you guys to just say, hey, what's up?
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
So we got some real pros and experts here. I found the Arundel Rivers Federation on Facebook. I think I posted a question about some oyster reefs or oyster reef balls in a question, and Miss Jennifer reached out to me, and she said she had all the information for me. So here we are, and she set it up, and we got Jesse here, the expert. So it says, Jesse, man, what do you do, man?
I'm the Southwestern Road River Keeper with the Arundel Rivers Federation. So I'm a professional advocate. I'm trained as an attorney, and my job is to look out for our three rivers and Herring Bay down in southern Anne Arundel County, Maryland.
Cool. And what about you, Jennifer?
I run the restoration program for the Federation, so I work with communities and other partners to obtain grant funding to do restoration work.
Sounds important, Jennifer. I think you kind of led me astray. You said you wasn't important. Just joking, just joking. So I guess first off, what caught my attention, like I said, was the reef balls. So whoever wants to jump in and chime in, like, what are these reef balls?
So we did a living shoreline project, and we had this idea to integrate some oyster habitat into the living shoreline. Typically, when we do a living shoreline, our goal is to both stop erosion and create new habitat through marsh creation. And we usually use rock structures called breakwaters. They're segmented, which means there's openings so wildlife can come and go. And usually these are all rock structures. Well, we had the idea to try oyster reef balls in place of some of these rock structures to create additional oyster habitat. The reef balls are actually made out of concrete from molds. It's like a big round ball with some holes in it. And we use these reef balls in place of the rocks so it could break up the wave action, but also create habitat for oysters. And the reef balls were preset with spat by our partners at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation prior to be brought on site. So our reef balls that are in the deepest part of the project had oyster spat put on them. And our partners over at the Coastal Conservation Association were the ones that made the reef balls for us. And so our hope is to see an oyster population thrive on these reef balls. It's a little bit too early into the project to see how successful it will be, but they were seeded with spat. We're going to be monitoring them over the next few years. But what makes this project unique is that the project is actually across from the Glebe Bay Oyster Sanctuary. It's one of our area's only oyster sanctuaries. So we hope to see some natural spat exchange between our oyster bed and the natural oyster reef at some point.
One thing that I would add, Jennifer nailed it with respect to the evolution of the project, but since it's been built, we've noticed that local fishermen are traveling out to these structures to go dipping with hand nets for crabs, and so oysters don't just filter the water every day, all day. They also provide this great habitat, and it's not an empirical scientific study, but the proof is kind of in the pudding that at least crabs are making their home there if folks are going out to try catching them.
Yeah, worst case scenario, even if our oysters are not as successful, we've created great habitat for all kinds of smaller critters and fish, as well as put in some stabilization to hold the marsh in place.
So if you could just talk about that a little bit, just like the marsh life, like, and the importance of having that structure, because I think what was it they were saying, like in New York, where the oyster mittens were so high, and it helps with storms and all of that stuff, along with erosion.
Yep, so that's the purpose of both the oyster reef balls and the rock structures. We want to break up that wave energy before it hits the shoreline, because it's that erosive energy that'll kind of carve away at the banks and pull that sediment out into the rivers. But by putting these rock structures or oyster reef balls in place, we can break up that wave energy before it hits the shoreline. And then when we do put in marsh grasses, they also act to kind of protect the marsh grasses while they establish it. It takes a few years for the marsh grasses to grow, so the more we can protect them initially, the better chance the marsh will have at thriving and providing habitat.
No doubt. So, Jesse, like, how is there any test or anything you've seen so far just with the water quality?
Well, in that particular area, we haven't been doing any localized water quality testing on the oyster reef ball structures that we've been talking about, but we do take water quality measurements in two very adjacent, very close places. One is the large-scale oyster sanctuary reef that Jennifer mentioned earlier. These reef balls are close enough to our oyster reef that is more than a decade old at this point and has been planted with new oysters every year, that the larvae generated on the sanctuary reef should be able to reach the oyster reef ball structures in the Living Shoreline project and strike and form new oysters on those reef balls. And we monitor water quality right there on that reef. And then we monitor water quality at the mouth of the creek that feeds the area. So the Living Shoreline project is reinforcing a peninsula, a little point that juts out and forms the mouth of the creek. So we monitor two places very close. And one encouraging detail that we've noticed is that the water clarity on the reef is considerably better than the water clarity throughout the South River where the reef is generally, but also better than the mouth of the creek, which is only 1/4 mile of open water away. So you can see that the oysters are filtering a lot of the pollution that would cloud water out right there in that localized area. And it also helps to drive up the pH in the area of the oyster reef. And as more carbon enters the atmosphere, a lot of it sinks into the waterways, and it has caused ocean acidification, which has gotten a lot of press over the past many years. But that acidification is also happening in the Chesapeake, and the pH overall has declined over the past couple of decades. A report came out analyzing 30 years of pH data in the Bay a year or two ago, and so it's an alarming trend, the acidification phenomenon, and oysters are also helping to buck that trend as well as improve water clarity.
And you probably hit it, Jesse, but the state of the river reports, like what were some of the major, was like where you were saying some of the major finds in it?
Yeah, so the impact of the oyster reef was one feature that we highlighted in our most recent report card. Another was just the tremendous impact that precipitation totals and intensities will have on estuarine rivers like ours that have a whole lot of impervious surfaces within their watershed. In 2018, it was a record-breaking rainfall year in the mid-Atlantic area, and also especially in Maryland and our county. We got a ton of rain. I don't remember the exact specifics. I feel like it was 40% or so more than average. And then in 2019 started off pretty wet, but by the end of summer, there was a big time drought in effect. And so the lack of rainfall had the effect of not washing a lot of pollution into the rivers. And so overall, all three of the rivers that we monitor improved in 2019 over their 2018 levels. And so, we certainly want to draw attention to all the important restoration work that goes on that we get accomplished in our watersheds. And we know that that's having an impact, but all of our work can't duplicate what Mother Nature can throw at us. And so, you know, the simple fact in my mind is that we had a lot less rain, so we had a lot less pollution in 2019 than we did in 2018, because 2019's raw data levels were fairly similar to what they were in 2017. So it seems like 2018 was a big blip on the line graph for pollution, and hopefully we don't get too many more like it.
No doubt, you're right about that. What other restoration projects are you guys working on?
That's your question, Jennifer.
And we have a lot of exciting projects coming up. We actually recently completed a project about 3,400 feet long in the Gravely community. That project also stretches into the county-owned Kings Branch Natural Area. This is probably one of our largest projects to date. At its deepest, the gully was probably nearly 20 feet deep. So you can imagine there probably wasn't much there as far as a gully a couple decades ago, back before the developments were put in, you know, add a couple larger developments, and all of a sudden you have a 20-foot gully going through the woods, and all that sediment that used to be in the woods is now out there in Flat Creek and the South River and the bay. So the opportunity to restore that site to the point where it's no longer eroding, but also treating habitat, treating stormwater, providing habitat. It's been really, really neat to see. So we're really grateful that project was able to happen, and you know, a huge thanks to our funders at the Chesapeake Bay Trust, Anne Arundel County, National Fish Wildlife Federation, and Maryland DNR. It's really great to see that wrap up earlier this year. And if you'd ever like to come down to Davidsonville, we're more than happy to show you around that site. This fall, we have some more exciting projects coming up, thanks to really the exact same funders I just mentioned. We are partnering with the Girl Scouts of Central Maryland to restore a gully going through the Girl Scout property. That project's probably in the ballpark of 1,400 to 1,600 feet. And you know, we really like working with the Girl Scouts because it's an opportunity to restore an area that has a lot of use by area schools and area kids. So we look forward to starting that at the end of the year. And then we're also doing another project in our Beards Creek watershed in Riva in partnership with the county, which is a really cool technique. A lot of times in these restoration sites, we'll use rock structures to create these step pools. But in areas that are flat and wet enough, we can actually use wood harvested on site to create these engineered log jams. Basically, we kind of pretend to be beavers, only we have to get lots of permits and spend lots of money to do it. But we create these engineered log structures, and we strategically place them in the stream to slow the flow of water and reconnect the floodplain. And so that one will be coming up later this year as well. And you're welcome to come out to see any of them. We probably won't be kicking off those until maybe November, December, but we're really looking forward to getting those in the ground.
That sounds awesome. So I want to ask you a question, but I want to stay on topic also. I got two questions, I guess. So one is, how do volunteers get involved? And the topic, the question is on topic, I guess, or off, I don't know, however you want to put it. What's the conversation like when builders or buildings want to go up? What's the conversation about the whole runoff and everything? Like, is that a topic that's like, you know, because it's important, you know, do they not care, or is it talked about, or is it all part of the plan?
So I'll handle those questions, I suppose. So, you know, volunteers in years pre-COVID, volunteers would reach out to us and we'd say, hey, you know, we've got a project that's going to be finished getting built on X date. If you want to come out on X+1, we're going to be planting trees, and you know, you can come and get in on that. And we would often also target specific groups. So, you know, we're very close to Annapolis, so we've had a lot of help from the Naval Academy. Midshipmen would send out a squad of, you know, 15 or 20 men and women to help us. And we were always psyched when we were getting a group of mids, because we know they're going to be fairly able and intelligent folks that we can give directions to once, and they're going to have strong backs. They can carry pots of dirt with trees in it around. And so, you know, but we've worked with all sorts of different groups, from elementary school kids up to retirees in age and from all different communities within our watershed. Lots of times the communities closest to the project will have been involved with it from, writing supports for our grant applications and things like that. And so a lot of times residents nearby want to get in because they want to see what's happening. So that's how things have worked in pre-COVID times. During the pandemic, and Jennifer can correct me if I'm wrong here, we have not had any substantial groups of folks coming together to do any of that work. I think the approach for our projects has been largely to rely on staff and interns to do planting and maintenance that we ordinarily would engage volunteers with. We're hoping to get back to some semblance of normal soon, just like everybody else. And, engaging with volunteers is one of the really fun things that we like to do, because it doesn't just result in, free labor help to get a specific task done. It's an opportunity to have conversations with all sorts of different people to explain what we're doing, why we do it, why it matters, and how they can help support us in future work. As for the development angle and what happens when development projects are in the works, that's very squarely my wheelhouse. I engage in those projects, both specific projects and overall policy related to development, all the time. The short answer is that there are a lot of laws on the books that are intended to prevent lots of sediment pollution while a construction site is opened up. There could be improvements in the wording of regulations and statutes, and there could be stronger commitments of policy and guidance from regulators, and that includes all levels of government, from cities and counties through the state and the feds, everywhere in the Chesapeake. I'm sure that if you talk to any watershed advocate, they would echo that sentiment. But I think an important thing that a lot of people don't realize is that the laws on the books are pretty solid. The thing that is really shaky is the enforcement of those laws. And that's where there are wide discrepancies between jurisdictions, and there are surprisingly wide discrepancies between administrations in the same jurisdictions. And it really just it often, unfortunately, comes down to politics and the demands of the day. And, not all of that is politics for self-serving reasons. I mean, for right now, for instance, in Anne Arundel County, where we do a lot of work, the County Department of Inspections and Permits is the department that monitors construction sites around here, and they've been really hamstrung and short-staffed in a lot of their operations by the COVID pandemic. And so, there are things that people can control, and my job is always trying to make sure that the people with power use it appropriately and wisely from an ecological standpoint. And then there are things that can't be controlled, and COVID's one of those things. Climate change is something that can't be controlled, but we can do our best to slow it, adapt to it, and things like that. And so one little example of what I'm talking about working in a more systemic level is I'm talking with advocates right now about the state's upcoming General Assembly, which doesn't start until January, but we're trying to formulate a new law statewide that would require more robust stormwater management controls for construction sites in the face of the increasing intensity and rainfall totals that we're seeing during this era of changing climate.
That was deep, man. I see why you're the man for the job.
I could go on for a long time, but I have to cut myself off when I feel like I'm getting a little too long-winded. When I would see my family start to fall asleep, that's when I know I should.
No, you're good, man. What was I gonna ask? Man, now that you let me see. Oh, what I was gonna ask you was I think Jennifer mentioned it earlier, and she was talking about oh man, I can't remember the word. Basically, the place where, hold on one second. And we're back. So yeah, I was the word was oyster sanctuary. What is an oyster sanctuary?
Sure. So an oyster sanctuary is an area marked off both physically in the rivers of the Chesapeake Bay with buoys. And I should say in Maryland's section of the Chesapeake Bay. I'm not sure how they do it in Virginia, but I suspect it's very similar. But they mark it off physically in the water with buoys, but also on maps that are available online. You can find out where the oyster sanctuaries in the rivers in Maryland are. And currently, I think there are 52, if memory serves me correctly, 52 oyster sanctuaries in the bay, in Maryland's part of the bay. And they range in size from very small, as small as maybe a half an acre, to very large on the order of hundreds of acres. And in the case of the South River, the oyster sanctuary is basically the top half, the upstream half of the river. And so one common misconception that I think a lot of people might have is that not all oyster sanctuaries are chock full of oysters. An oyster sanctuary just means there's a legal prohibition on catching oysters within that area out of the wild fishery. And I say out of the wild fishery because you are still allowed to do oyster aquaculture in a sanctuary. If a person decided they wanted to become an oyster grower, they could apply to the Department of Natural Resources for a lease, and then they would mark out the area that they want on a map, say this spot here is where I want to set up my oyster farming business. And then they have to prove that there's less than one oyster per square meter within that area on average, so that the department realizes this is an area that is not productive. It doesn't have a lot of oysters in it. If we allow this person to go and plant oysters in there with the understanding they'll take them out, at least during the life cycle of those oysters, they are doing the good work of filtering water and providing habitat and so on. And of course, any good farmer, oyster farmers included, are not trying to just plant once, take it all out and leave. The idea is that you would continue to do this periodically over the years and keep an oyster population sustainable in that area. So that's why aquaculturalists are allowed to harvest in sanctuary areas. But Maryland has a tremendous oyster fishery that is just wild fishery. And many of the watermen who ply the waters of Maryland's Chesapeake portion rely predominantly, if not exclusively, on what they can harvest from the wild fishery areas. And in fact, all of the citizens of Maryland are entitled during the oyster season to be harvesting a bushel of oysters a day. So, you need a boat, or you need tongs, or you need the strength and capability to dive down and pluck them off of the reef. You can't use, mechanical equipment for that, but it's something that we all enjoy as citizens of the state. So that's the nuts and bolts of oyster sanctuaries.
So legally in Maryland, you can get a bushel of oysters a day?
During season, and assuming that you're following all other regulations, yeah.
Very interesting, very interesting.
We all own that water. The state just keeps it in trust for us.
Right, cool. So back to the reef balls. I was reading something where you can adopt a reef ball. How does that work?
That's one of our programs that we came up with so that we could get the continued financial support needed to maintain the project. There's a lot of effort that goes into these sites initially through writing grants, obtaining all the construction funding. Our partners at CBF and the Coastal Conservation Association were invaluable. We did the project, it's done, it's in the ground. However, that's only part of the story. We need to go back year after year, sometimes season after season, and ensure the project's success. And actually just just last week we were back out planting additional marsh grasses. You know, you do a planting, but you never have 100% survival. So, you know, some of the plants might just die on their own. Sometimes the geese are a little too aggressive and rip them out. But there's any number of reasons that we need to continue returning to our sites year after year to maintain them. So programs like the Adopt a Reef Ball program give us the capacity to return to these sites year after year to continue working with the communities on maintenance and on replantings, because we really want to ensure their success.
It's awesome. I might have to, the Oyster Ninja podcast might have to have a reef ball out there.
Yeah, that would be great. There's more information on our website for anyone that wants to adopt a reef ball and support those efforts. But yeah, it keeps us being able to go out to these sites year after year and replant the marshes as needed, or reinstall the goose fencing to keep those geese away, because they can do quite a bit of damage.
Cool. So can I take a field trip to my reef ball?
Oh, we would love to take you out there anytime. Low tide is best, but yeah, whenever you want to get out there, we'll take you out to our reef ball site. We can do living shorelines that have been restored for 10 years so you can see the difference, or take you out to any of our restoration sites, whether they're completed or in the fall once we get equipment moving on our new sites. You know, you're welcome to see those as well. Just let us know.
That's if you want to go by land, but I can take you by water also.
Oh man,
There you
that's
go.
why
That's
I
a
like
better
Jesse.
offer.
I like Jesse. So just any other things that we should be on the lookout for? Any other things that where people can, I don't know, donate, sign up for, or I guess you can tell people all about the website and how to follow you guys.
Yeah, so, you know, our returnable project that we talked about this evening was the first time that we've done a project where a living shoreline project that incorporated reef balls into it. I'm sure would be interested in doing that again should the opportunity present itself, but so much of what we do is intended definitely to preserve oysters and the water quality that they need to continue being the, you know, the positive cycle that they are of creating their own habitat, filtering the bay's water, working 24/7, 365 days a year for the bay, which then we in turn can eat the oysters themselves, and we can eat all the other wonderful seafood that comes out of it, and we don't have to worry as much about nicking our foot on a barnacle or something if we go out swimming. You know, we want to make sure that there's enough water quality that the oyster population can really come back. It's about 1%, maybe a little less than 1% of its historic levels. And so there's a whole lot of room to improve things for oysters in the Chesapeake. And our restoration work is intended to make that kind of water quality so it's possible in the water. And our advocacy work is intended to provide the regulations and the incentives for everybody to adopt the sorts of behaviors and observe the sorts of fisheries management best practices that can allow that population to rebound. There's a lot more that, you know, I'd be happy to talk with any of your listeners about if they had any specific questions. And then as far as, you know, recent things, other interesting stuff to check out, tomorrow night, actually, there's going to be a webinar with an oyster aquaculturalist and a couple of Maryland legislators and a few other panelists who are going to talk about the impact of the COVID pandemic and all these restaurant closures and everything on the oyster fishery in Maryland, with an especial focus on aquaculture operations. So if there's any aspiring would-be oyster growers out there that want to learn about the business and what happens when things go badly in the business, they might want to tune into that. But it'll also give folks that like oysters and care about their restoration some ideas for, you know, how you can support that fishery. You might not have gone out to a restaurant to get oysters, but, you know, if you want, there are lots of seafood places that will shuck them for you if that's like a barrier to entry for anybody and things like that. So I don't have a link to it, but I could give you one and you could put it up with the video if you wanted.
Yep, for sure.
Happy to.
You got anything, Jennifer?
No, I think that summed it up pretty well. But if anyone wants to stay updated on what we're doing, you can always follow our Facebook page, Arundel Rivers Federation. And I guess our next biggest thing, do you want to mention the scorecard presentation that we do every year, just so folks know to keep an eye out for that?
Yeah, I mean, coming in the spring, we will be giving up the data on the 2020 season. The season of water quality monitoring runs from April 1st to October 31st, so we're still in it now, collecting data. But once Halloween comes and goes, we start crunching numbers and trying to figure out why we see anything that we don't understand right off the bat, doing some more research, calling other experts, and helping interpret all of the data we collect. We monitor 44 sites, and that's every week for that 7-month period, 44 sites, and we get a lot of data during the course of a season. So we're always excited once we've sussed out the mystery of the year, and would love to have anybody interested in this sort of work come out to a presentation, or depending on where we are in history, attend our Zoom meetings and things like that. So happy to have as many people in the tent as we can get.
Well, that sounds great, and I really appreciate y'all taking time out of y'all busy days to join the Oyster Ninja. And for all the YouTubers on here, if you're watching the video, yes, you know, I got a day job, if you were wondering. Yeah, thank you guys for taking time out and talking with us.
Thank
you.
you.
We appreciate it.
Hit us up anytime.
And yeah, exactly. That's what I was going to say. Hopefully we can get you guys back on here for an update and let us know how the reef balls are doing and the quality of water, and also to talk about the scorecards.
Yep, absolutely.
All right. Thank you guys.
Yep.
Thank you.
Take it easy.